Okay, well, here we go. So thanks for joining today. This is our Dreamit Live program that we're going to do periodically. This is our first one for Secure Tech. I'd like to introduce myself. I'm Bob Stasio. I'm the managing director for the Secure Tech program. And with me is the program manager, Cameron Watts, if you want to introduce yourself.
Hey y'all, Cameron here, Program Manager for Secure Tech. Nice to have you here.
Great. And we're calling from a couple different locations today. We're in Philly, but what we're going to talk about today for the first part of the conversation, for the first 5 minutes or so, we're going to speak a little bit about a topic that's was a little overlooked in the news last week that came out about APT31, or sorry, APT41, which stands for Advanced Persistent Threat 41, or otherwise known as Double Dragon. It was a report that was released recently by FireEye, with mostly a lot of their personnel, a lot of their analysts that come from the Mandiant Eyesight merger. So we'll get into that a little bit. But I want to talk about that and how it relates to some of our startups that we have in Dreamit and how we work with some of our startups to address that problem, some of the big pressing issues that are going on in security and cybersecurity today. So we'll kind of discuss and rope in some relevant startups to the conversation. So to discuss the APT41 program, really interesting report came out last week. This group, this China Nexus group, otherwise known as a Double Dragon, and basically what it is, it's a Chinese state actor group. So that was moonlighting in criminal activity. Super interesting. Basically, they were using non-public malware, kind of state-level malware, in some of their criminal activity, criminal hacking, if you will, that they were doing in their part time. So we call it moonlighting. And when I worked in the NSA and some of my work in the government, this was always something we were really concerned about, that people that use nation state level skills and even nation state level malware could use it for a criminal purpose. And we have a really interesting public report that FireEye released talking about it. So if you kind of a free plug to FireEye, and I believe probably from my friend John Holquest and his group who put this together. Really great. I highly suggest you go to their website and check it out. And what's so interesting about this group is that there's just so many different target sets that were caught up in this group. Everything from retailers. There was one example of a European retailer that was doing a merger that was caught up in some of the espionage that was going on here, to hotels that were targeted where other diplomats were staying. So really interesting. If you see on the screen here now, you could see some of the industries that were targeted over time. And what appears really interesting about this is that this group started to target the video game industry first, eventually went into other industries. Basically, what is thought here is that they maybe a group of hackers that were started off doing criminal activity targeting the video game industry, moved into kind of nation state support, nation state malware, either through contracting or otherwise, and then actually kind of continued that activity. And what's really interesting in the report, if you want to pull it up, Dustin, the analysts at FireEye were able to show basically the pattern of life, the activity that these individuals were doing. They could kind of map when they were doing Chinese espionage on a graph, and then doing their criminal activity kind of in their off time. They're actually able to combine that and show the hours they were working on each particular activity. Now, some of their techniques, what they were doing, they were basically one of their main entry points, their main access points into some of their target groups were through spear phishing, right? Not uncommon for state actors. In fact, there was a presentation that was done several years ago by a gentleman named Rob Joyce, former, and I think he might still be NSA. He was a former national cyber advisor at the National Security Council. He gave kind of a presentation on how NSA does attacking, a public presentation. And he said, basically, we do these very simple techniques. And he gave a lot of information out there if you want to check that out. But a lot of what he said was based around using spear phishing techniques. That's what these guys did too. And they would try to get onto their targets through spear phishing, and then they would a lot of times deploy a rootkit, sometimes one of their nation state level rootkits onto their targets. When they were doing their targets for criminal activity, they would often try to go on to, say, the video game industry, and they would try to manipulate game currency. So they would create fake game accounts and put money into game accounts and try to monetize that within this currency and video game programs. Sometimes if that didn't work, they would actually just do straight up ransomware on these individuals and try to monetize that type of criminality. And some of the things they were doing were also supply chain compromise. They would go on to programs, one in particular called C Cleaner, and they would try to get into the software early on in the stage of development and put malware in it at that early stage. So really, really interesting techniques, but kind of the marks of what they were doing were getting on to their targets, low and slow approaches, living there for long periods of time. In some cases, they were taking information out, like in pharmaceutical targets. They would actually take R&D information to try to get ahead of competitors and share information with maybe as part of the Chinese kind of 5-year plan with the Chinese government. And sometimes they were trying to monetize that on their own. So really, really typical techniques of these state actors to lay low and slow, use rootkits. And they had very, very targeted spear phishing when they're going in for their initial targets or initial access. So that's kind of the concept of how they were getting in and what they were doing. But I'd like to talk for a couple minutes about how, some kind of tie it back to innovation that's going up on the startup side, where startups are actually really attacking this problem and perhaps mitigating a lot of this type of threat. Because what we're seeing is you have this nation state level threat that's targeting a wide breadth of industry, from retail to law firms to pharmaceutical, which may not have been as prepared as, say, the government sector or the financial industry to combat this threat. So they're kind of outgunned in this manner. And we're seeing a lot of innovation in startups that are taking very high level techniques of defense and pushing them down and amortizing them across a wider customer base. And 2 startups I want to talk about in particular that we have in our portfolio are Graphis. So Graphis is a startup that defends against spear phishing attacks. Very, very highly advanced techniques using AI, artificial intelligence, to trace patterns over time to look for when spear phishing techniques occur. We actually use it at Dreamit. It has actually stopped some attacks for us in particular. They're a really interesting company that's doing that. And then another company I want to mention is called Threat Warrior. And Threat Warrior is a port span type analysis. They're packet analysis, if you will. They're looking at all traffic going in and out of network on the network switch. They plug into the port span of a switch, and they use AI to analyze techniques and patterns that may be occurring in your network that are going on by advanced actors that would be otherwise missed. So they're kind of looking for the needle in the haystack, so to speak, but doing it in such a way that really anybody can leverage them. Or I like to call them the advanced sock in a box. So they're kind of taking some of the TTPs, the tactics, techniques, and procedures that are used and leveraged by very high-level Fortune 100 companies, and they're kind of bringing it down to anyone. Anyone can use, 3-4 person security shop can leverage them. And I think those 2 companies really came up in my mind when combating this type of threat, when combating this nation-state level threat, because they're taking skill sets that are generally only seen at high-level SOCs in the government and the financial sector, and they're kind of bringing it down to everybody. So those were 2 that jumped out to me. So just brief overview of some interesting topic in the news I wanted to mention, and kind of tying it back to some of the companies that were the Dreamit program. But now I want to get to your questions, and I see we have almost 40 people on the live chat right now. So yeah, feel free to post your questions in there. We're going to start to take your questions. But I want to remind you before we get started about our fall cycle. We're really heavily recruiting for our fall cycle right now, fall 2019 cycle that's going to start in September. We still have time. If you want to get your application in, go to dreamit.com/apply. Get in ASAP. We're heavily recruiting. We have a lot of companies in the pipeline, and we only have so many spots. So if you want to be considered, obviously we're the secure tech vertical. We definitely want to look at secure tech, but we also have the health tech and urban tech vertical as well. But get your application in really quickly so we can look at it and make a decision to get you into the fall program. Okay, so I'd like to go ahead and go into the questions right now. So Cameron's been kind of curating some of the questions. So Cameron, what questions do we have in the comment section now?
And remember, as you're posting in there, you want to put your location as well. But
Sure.
first one is from Victor. Which are the most common threats for startups that use private apps for their internal operations? How to defend against those threats?
That's a good question. So if you're a startup and you're trying to defend yourself against other types of threats, it can be really challenging because you are just a small team. You have a lot of other priorities. I would say probably the best thing you can do is first have a strategy and a plan. You need to make sure you have some type of compliance, base level plan in place. There's a lot of free resources out there to do that. You could even go to NIST.gov, where I think it might be NIST.gov or NIST.org, the National Institute of Science and Technology. NIST has a great cybersecurity strategy and plan where you can kind of outline the basics of your strategy to determine your risk. But a lot of startups, the best way to really defend yourself is by outsourcing a lot of your security and defense. So using something like AWS or using Google, those types of functions, those types of offerings can give yourself a lot of defense on the back end. So you're not hosting your own server and having to maintain it. And as you grow and as you multiply over time, using things like managed security providers are really useful. So you don't have to in-house a lot of your security team. But, a lot of times that's putting the cart before the horse. You really need to get that strategy down first and determine your risk and determine where your threats are coming in before you do any of that. But those are just a couple of tactical techniques for you. Okay, so feel free as we're talking, as we're going through the chat, please post your questions in the comment section. Any other questions that have come up, Cameron?
And again, just to reiterate, we want to make sure that everybody's adding their location as well as their questions.
Sure.
Now, real quick, Bob, if I'm a startup, let's talk about kind of the raise. I feel like a lot of companies that we've seen come through the program, really struggle with trying to understand how much they should raise and when. What kind of advice do you have for that?
Sure, absolutely. So yeah, one of the biggest challenges we have, and probably the biggest mistake we see with startups, and a phrase we use a lot is time is not a fundable milestone. So some companies will come in and say, I will raise $3 million because that's going to get me a year's worth of runway. That's not a way to present to an investor to get them interested in investing in you, because an investor's interest is not to fund you, not to basically fund your career, fund your lifestyle for the next 12 months. You need to come up with achievable goals and KPI, key performance indicator, and understand how you're going to get there. And one person I like to work with a lot on kind of brainstorming on this is a gentleman by the name of Mike Visuco, who's a CTO of Carbon Black. He's a local Philly guy as well. And sometimes we get together and we talk about ways startups can present their best foot forward in these presentations. And the way we like to think about it is thinking about it in terms of a go-to-market strategy and talking about it in concentric circles. So let's talk about the first type of funding you're going to get. Maybe it's what we call a friends and family round. So you get a little bit of funding to kind of give a proof of concept. Well, you have a small target you're going to go after initially to understand, improve, and validate your strategy and prove product market fit. So maybe if you're a company that's going after the financial sector, you want to see how you can pare that down to the most achievable, smallest target set, total addressable market set for you. So maybe you're located in Philadelphia, so you have a small geographic reach, and you have advisors, or you have mentors, or you have board members that have reach into Philly-based financial groups that are only doing mutual funds or something like that. That's your first target you're going after, and you have a small amount of money to actually target that group. Well, your next round of funding will build out that concentric circle and increase the size of the market you can go after. And then you could maybe go after a larger geographic target. You could expand to New York and Washington, D.C. You could expand to other markets within the financial sector. So explaining how that money and how much you need to actually expand that group and basing your calculation on that and what are the second and third order effects of that. So in order to expand to that group, you need more salespeople, more money for travel. You need more money to set up servers in those locations. I'm just kind of spitballing here, but really calculating that and basing those facts and figures on how much you want to raise, that's a really good way to present the amount of money you want to raise and calculating it out and showing your work versus just giving a number, $3 million, and saying that'll give you runway. So that's often a strategy that we go through with our startups and help them determine the amount of money they want to raise in the next round. Okay. Next question. Feel free, again, put your questions in the comment section. Would love to hear what city you're coming in from. Looks like we have a couple more companies coming from all across the world. We have somebody from Bogota, Colombia. Any other questions? Go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah, Bob, just another one of the common things that we're seeing with startups today is, really how to calculate that TAM, the total addressable market. What are some of the tips on how to calculate that?
Sure. And this is, again, we have a basic way we do it at Dreamit, and I kind of expand on it a little and put my own spin on it or our own spin on it for the secure tech side of things. So TAM is super easy to calculate. It's literally how much you charge for your service or your product times how many customers there are. That's really it, right? It's not more complicated than that. And that's kind of a bottom-up approach. We do see startups come in and have kind of a top of funnel approach when calculating a TAM. I think that's just a lot harder to defend. We've seen startups present this model of TAM to investors, and an investor literally stopped the startup and said, "Hey, that's the best explicitive way I've heard TAM explained ever in my life." So, we've had some really good feedback about that. But really, it's just that simple. And kind of the spin I put on it from a security perspective, when we go after companies and we're looking at startups to bring into the program, I generally look for enterprise type startups that are selling into enterprise. Doesn't have to be large enterprise, could be small and medium size. And in cyber, what we consider small and medium size is 500 people and below. I like to base it on people. And what I've done is actually gone through the U.S. Census. The last U.S. Census, unfortunately, has happened in 2010. We're going to get a new one this year, which is good. But I based a lot of my facts and figures on that census. So I looked at that census and I said, it's very detailed, right? You can see how many companies are in the United States, what sectors they're in, how big these companies are. I looked through this and I said, what companies are really above about 100 people in size and are in particular markets that are going to be effective for enterprise security startups? So that could be retail, finance, energy, healthcare, government. So I looked across this entire broad scope of the companies that exist within the United States, and I came up with the number 18,000. So there's about 18,000 potential targets for most companies. Now you could get a little deeper and say, well, I'm only really selling into finance, and you can just pull out the finance numbers. But if you're broadly selling security, because security is kind of a horizontal more than it is a vertical, it's about 18,000. So really, it's how much you charge for your product or service times 18,000, and that's your TAM. And that's kind of a pretty broad way to do it. But for the most part, it's very accurate if you're going after that market. And as I was discussing with my buddy Mike DeSucco when we discussed this, when you're coming up with a go-to-market strategy and you're trying to get more refined and getting a particular target market for a go-to-market strategy and get really, really focused, you can pull out those particular sections of companies that are more accurate to who you're going after. And again, that's from 2010. It's a little outdated, but it gives you a good estimate. It's very defensible when you're talking to investors. We're going to get a new census this year, and I'm looking, or probably 2021, I think it'll actually be released, but looking forward to when that comes out.
So Bob, a question from Stephen Philly.
Okay.
Yeah, and if I'm a startup and trying to catch a CISO's attention, what are the things that CISOs care most about?
Yeah, very, very, very good question. Basically, the CISO is overwhelmed a lot of times with a lot of vendors. I think when I was at IBM, we used to use the quote that most CISOs use 80 different products from 40 different vendors. And it's average, a little survey that we did. So they're inundated with vendors hitting them, and they still have a lot of problems, right? They have a lot of problems they want to solve. So they have to prioritize the vendors that they're going to use to try to solve their problems. And every single CISO has to, kick the tires on your product. They're not going to just sign a purchase order based on faith alone that your thing is the best thing since sliced bread because you say so. It's just not the case anymore. They have to try it out. So one of the things they're going to ask and want to look for is, how quickly can you set this up? How quickly can you set this up and get this going? Not necessarily to do a full-blown deployment, although that is important. They're looking to say, how fast can you prove to me that you can actually provide value? I've worked in some companies with some companies in the past, which I won't name, that they took a year or longer to set up their product to eventually show value. CISOs don't have time for that, right? They can't sign $1 million check to do a proof of concept for a year to maybe show value at the end. You have to show value within days or weeks, right? You got to get it set up quickly and do that. And that's kind of the second point is, how fast can you actually connect to my devices, right? What do you connect with? What out of the box, what do you connect to? And mainly they're looking for what major SIMs do you connect to? You can connect to QRadar, Splunk, Alien Vault. What can you connect to? What connections are you providing out of the box that I don't have to have a lot of services to do so? And then probably the third thing they're thinking about is, what additional headcount do I have to hire to host your product, right? Is it a SaaS product and it's really easy and I'm literally just sending everything to the cloud? Or do I actually have to have 7 people on staff full time to maintain this thing? So those are a lot of their concerns that they're thinking.
Awesome. So
any
so
other
we got
questions?
another question.
Okay. Yep. Great.
Yeah. So kind of to piggyback off that a little bit, right? And so it's, regarding CISOs, if you're trying to get a POC or a trial started, what are kind of the tricks or any traps that you see out there that we've seen maybe from customer sprints and things like that?
Yeah, excellent question. So we have seen some of the larger companies, and we do work with some large companies in our customer sprints, like Morgan Stanley, Bank of America, BNY. A lot of the larger firms out there, they really want innovation. They want to work with startups. They've actually stood up their own little innovation teams and innovation shops to have startups come in and plug their system into a sandbox to actually show the value and show proof of concept. So understanding how to work with those offices are an excellent way to try to get into those larger companies. That's if you're working with a larger company, getting in with those and kind of using those as I would try to use those as an entry point versus going to a CISO, because a CISO or the CISO's direct team are just so busy and so inundated with vendor fatigue. And the innovation shop is really interested in looking for these startups. So that's one thing I would point out. And the other thing, if you're working with maybe a smaller or medium-sized company that doesn't have this innovation shop, you probably want, even if you have a SaaS product, you want to have an option to deploy your system on-prem a lot of times, especially because some data you may be using or leveraging is sensitive, that they don't want to send this information to the cloud, especially during a POC or trial. And I'll give you one example on a company that will hopefully be coming into our program in this next cycle, called Zero Eyes. Zero Eyes is a company that does video analysis or video identification of weapons, mainly in schools, right? They're targeting schools as their initial go-to-market. And they're going into a school, and the school says, well, I love your product, it's great, but I can't send images of children out to the cloud. I don't care how safe you say your cloud provider is. I just, I can't take that risk, and I can't open up that legal risk to myself. So a lot of times they have to deploy their system on-prem in-house. So even if your system is mainly working on the cloud, you may want to have an option that has an on-prem version to do, like, even if it's just a quick box you plug in, and they sell these little, we used to use them at IBM, because we had this problem at IBM too. We had these little boxes with our solution on it that were like this big. I forget the name of them, but it was almost like an Apple Mini, one of those Apple Mini boxes that you would just plug in and had all our stuff on it. And it wasn't a full-blown version of our software. It didn't have all the horsepower, but it was good enough for the pilot. So you may want to consider that, because that's often a consideration in not only the physical security world, like I mentioned with Zero Eyes, but in cyber as well, and particularly in finance, where they're highly regulated on where their personally identifiable information goes. Okay.
No, and
Uh,
that's a great
okay, so I
leadway
see.
into the
Okay,
next into the next question, and it's
sure.
about
Yeah, go.
physical security startups. So in terms of trying to sell into government or law enforcement, what are some key things that you see, the struggles and also on the best practices for the startups that are in the physical security space to try to help enter the market?
Sure. So a couple things on physical security, especially if you're selling into the government or law enforcement. One of the products that I was working with at IBM was called I2. And I2, it's not a physical security product, but it was an analysis product, and it was heavily used in law enforcement. When it first started off, they had a term called cops selling to cops, right? Um, the law enforcement community is very, I guess the word would be mistrustful of outsiders. They're really insular community. It's a community built on trust. If you're one of theirs, if you're one of their own, they're more inclined to then know that you understand their problem and understand where they're coming from. So hiring somebody or leveraging a firm that has former law enforcement individuals working for you, or salesperson that has former law enforcement experience working for you, is really important, because they understand the problem better than anybody else. It's a very niche problem set sometimes, and it's a very niche language that they use. They use even acronyms that nobody else understands or knows. Just having that understanding is really important. So I always make that recommendations to startups in this space. And the other thing I would say is that you have to work within their budgets. They often have very small budgets and very weird budget cycles, and they sometimes have to go out and get a special approval for budgets. So having a modular, I guess, licensing model is very important too, so they can purchase a little bit. There's a saying in Italian called "do the small deal before you do the big deal." I won't say it in Italian. I guess it sounds better. But doing a small deal for $500 a month, so they can try it out and gain understanding of the value before you sign the $5 million deal, is really important. If your solution works and it provides some value, they will go to the ends of the earth to try to get money to fund this. But you really have to start out and show the value first, and doing it on a small modular size basis is very important. So probably have time for one more question. I see we have about almost 50 people in the room, people from all over. And is there one more question in there, Cameron, that we can answer before
Yeah,
we?
we actually got a couple more, so
Sure.
we might
I'll
go
do.
a couple
We'll do two
couple
more.
minutes
Two more is
over.
fine. Yeah, sure,
Yeah.
no problem. I dropped my
So
pen. I'm just
anybody
going to
else
pick
want
it
to
up.
get their last parting questions in?
Sure. Yep. Go ahead. Sorry, drop my
So
pen. Yeah. Go ahead.
so the next one we have Mike asking, and Mike is asking about, what's the best way to employ a successful POC in the cybersecurity space. He saw that Graphis had a 15-day free trial and also a true pilot program. What do you see the
Yeah.
pros and cons of either of those approaches are?
Great question. So that's what I love about Graphis. I mean, I've known actually Manoj for a long time, who's a CEO. Like Manoj a lot too, but I love the way they approach their sales technique or their sales method. It is a low barrier to entry. There was a product that I had looked at a while ago that I worked with that was a competitor to me called Maltego, which had a similar technique where they basically gave you a free version to download their software before you try it out as much as you want before you can buy the premium version. And this was in kind of the threat analytics, cyber analytics, threat hunting space, which is a very high end space, and we were trying to target at IBM. But sometimes Maltego would eat our lunch because the individual, the user, just wanted to try it out first and see what it was like and see the value, even if it was a very watered down version and not the full horsepower version. So I think sometimes in this space in cyber, you need to show the value very quickly, even if you're just showing a free version or giving a 2-week trial version. A lot of times these are new innovative programs, and I think maybe Mike from Formotive was the one who asked that question. They're a great example of this because their company does this high end fraud analysis. It's a very greenfield opportunity. You're coming in to a customer that's not doing this already. So you have to say, well, I'm not doing it now. I'm living fine. I'm working in my job totally fine right now. Why should I use your product? And showing how much of a difference it can make, and doing that for free or doing that with a very low barrier to entry is very important. Some of the pitfalls, though, is you have to have the so what in there, right? You have to have the how you convert that into a deal. If I provide this to you, you will do Y. Now, I would say this, that's important when you do a paid trial and a paid POC, because that's a little different. When we're talking about what I mentioned with Graphis or what I mentioned with Maltego, there's really low barrier to entry and there's very low effort on the startup's part, right? Graphis is not really doing anything other than providing the service, having the person click on a software and deploying it. Maltego's doing the same thing. There's not a lot of man hours being spent. If you're going into a customer and you're spending man hours and consulting services, connecting your product to their network and their data sources, that's when you have to have a give to get. Hey, I might be able to do this for free for you to make sure there's that low barrier to entry, but it's not free for me, right? It's costing services, it's costing time on my part. So if I achieve this KPI or these KPIs, you will do this. You will agree to sign this purchase order or move into a higher level trial or a paid trial. I may do this free trial, but if I achieve these objectives, we move into a paid trial. Having those laid out and having that agreed to, super important. Don't just walk into a paid trial or sorry, an unpaid trial for 6 months to have say, oh, that was I use this amount of time to see what else is out there in the competitive landscape. Have that agreement in writing, and usually having that agreement in writing is good, because the customer, it is free from a monetary standpoint, but they're spending time too, so they're committing a lot of effort on their end as well. Okay.
So yeah, I just want to I just want to remind the viewers and everything that we had a couple comments and questions coming in, so we're going to go a little bit over. We're going to go till about 12:45. So again, if you haven't already done it, post in the comments and tell us what city you're from. We're going again until 12:45. Now, the next question, Bob, is from Victor. And Victor asks, which are the main cybersecurity challenges in using MQTT protocol?
MQTT. Spell that out. What do you mean by that? I'm going to Google it just so I. You mean, okay, so the MQT is ISO message query telemetry transport. Is that what you're talking about? I think that's just a little too deep and technical right now for this conversation. So I think we'll go ahead and skip that question. Try to keep it to kind of high level business type stuff. I guess we're working with startups. Yeah,
absolutely.
Sure, go ahead.
Yeah, so let's kind of think to some of the things that we saw a lot during the customer sprints and things, and especially we talked about the physical security as well. When getting that conversation started, what is the key things that you can push in and try to, get the problem across very clearly? What's the best way to kind of round that out and get that very quickly?
When you're pushing to the customers, when you're briefing the customers?
Yeah.
So what we do at Dreamit, and so we have some of the former cohort members on here, they can attest to that. We really spend a lot of time trying to get your pitch down to about 5 minutes, a customer pitch, right? So we literally set out a slide deck, a template to say, here are the things you need to say up front to the customer. What problem you're solving, how you solve it better than anybody else. Talk a little bit about the traction you've made, and then talk about a way forward. Talk about the next steps, how you actually move forward in a trial. Literally that fast. Those are the key things you need to get out. A lot of times, startups spend a lot of effort, a lot of time talking about their life history and their story, talking an hour-long conversation, and they never really get to the point of what they do. Sometimes we could even squeeze a little bit of a short demo in there, just a concept of what they're doing, but that's really what the customer wants to hear. That's what the CISO wants to hear. We've had several customer partners, we've walked out of meetings and they've said, man, you guys just showed us 6 companies in 2 hours, and I really understand what they do. And usually it requires a vendor, each vendor, when they come and brief us, will ask for 90 minutes just for themselves. So they get a lot of value in getting to the point very quickly. And we spend a lot of time doing that. It reminds me of, I think it's the Mark Twain quote. Maybe it's not attributed to him, but he said, "I apologize for the length of this letter. I didn't have time to make it shorter." It actually takes a lot of time to make something short, right, and get to the point. And we spend a lot of time doing that, which is not an easy task sometimes. But that's really what we focus on, and our customer partners really appreciate that because they are looking for innovative startups. They are looking for ways to work with startups, and they just really need to understand what you do and what the value is. So that's part of what we do in our customer sprints, is getting that message out very, very quickly.
No, that's great feedback. And Bob, now those were the questions. I know you had a few points that you wanted to hit before we get off. So, if you want to lead into that.
Yeah, sure. So thank you all for attending our live Dreamit Live. We have more shows coming. Follow Dreamit Ventures on LinkedIn. You'll get the alert when we go live. You could go on dreamit.com/live, so you could actually suggest what future shows we should talk about, give some feedback, and you could see the full schedule. You could also go to dreamit.com/apply if anything I said here was very interesting. You want to learn more about the Dreamit program and you want to apply to the program. We're heavily recruiting right now. We have our next cohort starting in September. So we do have a lot of options. We have a lot of startups who have applied. So get in there quick so we can see you and we can talk to you. And feel free to follow us on YouTube, Twitter, and LinkedIn. You can see all of our content there. We have some really great videos on YouTube. You could get to it through our website as well, but you can see some videos about what our customer sprints are about, what our investor sprints are all about. We also have this great segment called Dreamit Doses, where we talk about a lot of the same topics we were mentioning here today, just some typical pitfalls and traps that startups go through, and some great advice there. So again, thanks for joining. Feel free to also DM me, direct message me on LinkedIn if you want, or email me at bob@dreamit.com if you want to talk to me directly and you're interested in applying to our program. Thanks, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks, Sarah.